So we're very grateful to our maestros at the control board, and now with Dr. Schmidt, perhaps you'd start the clock rolling, would you? Thank you. Dr. Bridgewater.
Now I've been put on notice. I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of climate change for people and nature, but inevitably I'm going to touch on some of the things that were revealed by some of the earlier speakers. But on the basis of tell 'em, and tell 'em again, I'm not going to skip over it too much, but just to use it to re-emphasize. There are two things I want to say before I start the presentation, though, and one is to explain that the graphic on the left-hand side of the slides is a piece of artwork that was designed by some Aboriginal Australians to represent some of the key features of conservation in Australia some 20 years ago. I've used that because I think we heard yesterday about the role of Indigenous peoples and their concepts of spirituality. I will also use the word from time to time culture, and that by using that term I'm incorporating all kinds of human thought without spelling out a long list. Secondly, each slide you may or may not be able to see has a little tiny blue saying, "The world is a global garden." And when those of us who were in Memphis heard the Metropolitan of Detroit give his homily last Sunday, he actually used more or less the same words. And the world as a global garden is something I wrote about nearly 15 years ago. Some of my acquaintances are not very keen on me using it because they think it disavows the natural world. I think, however, we have to be realistic. We are, in fact, living in a global garden, and what we have to be is good gardeners. Let me start with some press matter, because there's a lot of press attention here. And 2 days ago in the local newspaper, Jane Lubchenco, the administrator of NOAA, was quoted as saying, among other things, that we're seeing more conflicts in our ocean space. Solutions will inevitably require doing things differently, but what that is, we don't really know. And that also is a theme, I'm afraid, which will be a bit in my presentation. It's still the unknown unknowns, to quote somebody in this country. Said something a while ago. So what do we know? Well, observational evidence, you've heard it in spades, and it's all been a little bit gloomy this morning, first thing. Many natural systems, of course, are affected by temperature increases. We know all about, and we've heard again re-emphasized today from Bob Correll, the problem of changes in ice cover, salinity, oxygen levels, ocean circulation. If you look at the key interactions in coast and ocean systems, they're all interlinked. And yesterday's session was entitled The Interconnectedness of All Things. That's exactly the same title that we should be using this morning. All things are interconnected. And you can see by this mess of arrows some of the key problems. The red boxes are some of the important elements that we need to bear in mind. And it's not just about climate change, it's about other things, other stresses that we as a species are doing to the planet. We focus on climate change, but climate change alone is not itself the biggest problem. The biggest problem is climate change plus everything else. I'm going to skip over these fairly quickly, but Bob mentioned ocean acidity. I call it here a sleeper problem because it hasn't had the publicity that many of the other things have, and I'm very pleased that he spoke about it this morning. Because certainly many ocean organisms do rely on calcareous skeletons from this same coccolith that he showed to coral reefs. And we hear a lot about coral bleaching, but it's not just coral bleaching, it's the increasing acidity that may well affect coral reefs in the future. Could we have a world without corals? What would a world without corals actually mean? Well, here we look at consequences, and ecological consequences are fairly horrendous, because coral reefs are not just pretty places. They're not just good places for tourists. They're the source of livelihood for many millions of people, the source and sink for many pelagic species, but critically in the context of what we're talking about here, they dampen and buffer tidal surges. And we must not forget the physical barriers that these ecosystems give us as a species. As I say, it's not just the whole range of other species that they support, important though that is. For us, it's these physical benefits. So if we look at issues of ecosystems, in general, ecosystems provide a very wide range of what are now known as ecosystem services. There are 4 different types: provisioning all kinds of products from food, fiber, etc. They're regulating functions. They regulate climate by sequestering carbon dioxide, although, as you heard, that function is getting pretty saturated. They regulate water, they regulate erosion, they provide pollination, they purify water. There are cultural services, spiritual enrichment, recreation, all of these things that sometimes, nearly most times, in fact, we take for granted. This is a real service from ecosystems, and if the ecosystem can't function, we can't avail ourselves of that service. And then supporting. This is a difficult one because there's a whole range of things that ecosystems do which actually provide support for all other systems. The idea of ecosystem services has become fairly mainstream in ecological thought now, and it's linked with economics. Why don't we pay for ecosystem services? The problem is that this is far too anthropocentric, because ecosystem services not only provide services for us as one species, they're providing services for other ecosystems. So again, think of the interconnectedness of all things. There's no doubt of the importance of forests in managing and mitigating against the effects of climate change. But, and it's a big but, forests are not the only ecosystems on the planet, and many wetlands have an even more important role in absorbing excess carbon dioxide and storing it in stable forms. Again, as Bob has shown, under conditions of warming, those same wetlands can actually release not only carbon dioxide but also methane. So managing the world's wetlands is actually as important, although in my view, frankly, more important than managing the world's forests. And coastal wetlands, very important here, have key roles in managing known effects of climate change, particularly floods, tidal surges, and droughts. So all this boils down to the fact that ecosystem resilience in this coming century may well be exceeded. I think that will be exceeded because of climate change. But, as I said at the start, not just climate change, with associated disturbances and with other global change drivers. What are the human consequences then of this? Well, more people in millions are projected to be flood affected by 2050. We've heard again this morning. So the major areas such as the megadeltas of Africa, Asia, and the Americas are at greatest risk. Yet, as we heard yesterday in one of the opening addresses, developed country coastal capitals also have been building flood defenses. London, New York, Amsterdam, Tokyo were all mentioned. But they have high potential flood risks. Just building flood gates doesn't guarantee success, although it does show some limited foresight amongst an area where generally we lack foresight at all. The sea level rise and associated effects of human activity become then a major issue. If you compound that with the loss of coastal wetlands, including fringing mangrove forests and salt marshes, you have really a big problem. Here is a before and after picture of an area in Thailand where before you had an abundant mangrove forest. It's very nice, very attractive. If you like mosquitoes, it's not so nice and attractive, but it's a very pleasant place to be. However, large swathes of this ecosystem in Thailand and many, many other countries, both in Asia and increasingly in Latin America, are being cleared, leaving a very narrow coastal fringe, which itself is not sufficient buffer, and behind it, ponds raising fish, but particularly shrimp, which are destined for the plates of the diners in this country, in the country to the north, and in particular to all the countries in Europe, represented ably by the ambassador from France. Human consequences of all of this. We have the sea level rise associated with the effects of human activity. And the loss of coastal wetlands, including fringing mangrove forests and salt marshes, are known to be a real problem. If we keep mangroves, if we keep salt marshes, then in fact we can buffer against some of the effects which are going to come whatever we do about climate change. And this kind of before and after photograph underneath is from the tsunami, which took place in 2004, and we had experience of this in the Pacific, in Samoa and Western Samoa recently. Tsunamis are not a climate change phenomenon, of course, but the associated storm surges are maybe what we will see more of in the future. And these storm surges that we know will occur in parts of Asia where there were intact mangrove systems left, the damage that came from the tsunami was significantly less. Note, less. It wasn't non-existent, but it was significantly less. If Sri Lanka had been surrounded by an intact coastal system, the damage to Sri Lanka would have been not negligible, but certainly very much less than the enormous human tragedy that occurred in 2004. So that we know from that line. So the bottom line is the only certainty is greater uncertainty in our knowledge of climate changes on these ecological and physical systems and our ability to deal with that knowledge. Yet many other species, like this jackass penguin from South Africa, now depend on us finding the right solutions. And I've given you a little thought bubble as to what the jackass penguin might be thinking. So can we fix this? I think, actually, there are some fixes we can employ. It's not all gloom and doom. Humanity is at a point where we need to reinforce and reaffirm our stewardship of the ecological life support base, as well as the global commons for sustained human well-being. But we need to find a new model of societal and ecological management which recognizes both the full significance and value of biodiversity and the ecosystems that that biodiversity supports. And I put those words in red for a very good reason. Stewardship we've heard about several times in several different presentations in the last day or so. But I wrote a piece recently where I had the word stewardship in, and I was told, you can't talk about stewardship, that's too religious. And I think that is a very important statement, because stewardship is exactly the word that I need. It's exactly what I mean. And if it's too religious, then it means that we must bring together science and religion in order to understand how we can be more effective stewards. I want very briefly to talk about something else that we heard yesterday, the words wise use. This is a phrase that occurs in the convention text of the Ramsar Convention, which is a convention that was established in 1971 before the first Stockholm meeting, the first UN gathering on environment took place. And that convention talks about the need for the conservation and wise use of all wetlands, blah, blah, blah. But wise use is very, very important. It's not sustainable use. It's not sustainable development. It's wise use, using nature wisely. Wise use of wetlands has now unfortunately been redefined or defined in a slightly more complex way, but I reproduce it here because I think it's important. The wise use of wetlands is the maintenance of their ecological character within the context of sustainable development, achieved through the implementation of an ecosystem approach, or the ecosystem approach. And I show a picture here which shows some migratory birds in a nice piece of wetland opposite an industrial establishment. Well, what you can't see is that wetland was taken from a road bridge, and the reason the wetland is there is because the road bridge changed the sedimentation patterns and created it. That's a totally artificial system, and yet it is now part of the migratory patterns from Australia to North Asia of those particular birds. All human actions are affecting biodiversity in general, and some are not necessarily bad, and we need to recognize what are the good ones and turn our bad actions into good ones. So, as we learn to say in this country, we can fix it, yes we can, and the vital elements are promoting the resilience of ecosystems, managing human ecosystem interactions proactively, and here's one that may surprise you, embracing the cultural underpinnings of environmental management. Environmental management, if it's mechanistic, is not enough. We have to have the cultural elements, whether it's from indigenous knowledge, whether it's from a Western spiritual viewpoint, whatever. If you don't have that cultural underpinning, your mechanistic environmental management will not work effectively. And understanding that, we must adapt to as well as mitigate against the effects of climate change. It's happening, it's with us, it's not going to stop, as you've heard. We have to find out how we can work with it. And we need to develop the right governance mechanisms as well as communicating clear messages. There's one very brief problem I'll mention briefly, which I call eco-globalization. One of the things we have done very effectively as a species is mixed up every other species. We brought species from continent to continent, sometimes deliberately, often accidentally. And in the marine environment, we've done that spectacularly with disastrous results. But, again, we have to manage the mess we have created. And it is possible to do it, but it needs more wise thought. And in that sense, we need to understand where the resilience points in the socio-ecological systems that we live in. So let's talk about rebalancing. Complex adaptive systems, including ecosystems and socio-economic systems, never respond to change in smooth fashion. We heard yesterday about tipping points and turning points. I talk again about it today. Tipping points are rapid change, and they occur when the cumulative effects of environmental change and disturbance reach critical thresholds, often with disastrous consequences. And I illustrate that with a picture of Angkor Wat and no further comment. Rebalancing. The climate change response is not gradual. It's often sudden, plunging ecosystems into rapid and irreversible change. We hear very often stories about species marching northwards, up mountainsides, etc. You can forget it. It's not really going to happen like that very much. Some species will, those with wings certainly. Those with roots, not so easy. And that means that many species will have to sit where they are until there is an environmental catastrophe or a key tipping point. That means that all of our protected areas that we've established across the planet, we need to think about in new ways. They're not necessarily going to be protected forever and ever. By law, yes, but not against climate change. And therefore, we need to imbue our ecological as well as our socio-cultural systems with resilience. Resilience, there are 3 points to resilience: persistence of things, adaptability of systems, and transformability, the ability for a system to transform into something more resistant and more resilient. Managing resilience, therefore, is learning how to avoid changing thresholds between alternate regimes and how to transform the system safely when necessary. I'd like to finish by talking what I call fuzzy systems. I think we have an institutional failure at international level in terms of international governance. We cannot go on having meeting after meeting with delegates flying all around the world to reach the conclusion that they need another meeting to have another meeting. We have reached a nonsense stage. We know what the problems are. We know what, in some cases, the solutions are. In other cases, we know there are no solutions, but we're not fixing it. And we have to. We have to find new ways of doing it. And these are just some names of the spheres. I don't have atmosphere there, but there's geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, anthroposphere, the sphere in which we as human beings live, linguosphere, the sphere of language, communication, and noosphere, the concept of Taya de Chardin. So I think we need a new system of fuzzy governance. Governance basically being a process that involves interactions of diverse public and private actors. There's sometimes conflicting objectives and the instruments chosen to steer it. The UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, in fact, I think are a good model for fuzzy governance. There's co-management in these systems associated with high levels of self-evaluated effectiveness. The key is local participation and involvement, from local to national to international, not from international to national to local. That clearly is not working, with enhanced support and integration of conservation and development. And here's just one such biosphere reserve in the mouth of the River de la Plata. Well, communication, as I've said, is critical. I don't think we're getting our messages out. This is not a science message. This is an advert from Diesel Jeans promoting their so-called global warming ready, showing Amazonian parakeets in St. Mark's Square in Venice. They may sell a few more jeans, but the message they give that actually this is going to be okay, St. Mark's looks quite dry, there's no water, and you're going to have these lovely birds around instead of the pigeons. This is actually a disaster, and we have to, if clothiers want to sell clothing by using climate change, then we've got to tell them how to do it. 31 seconds, and here's the first of the epilogue slides. We have real problems. Solving the problem in Copenhagen is important, But we also need to develop future strategies for adaptation. And if we don't solve the problem in Copenhagen, it's not the end. Maybe it's the end of the beginning. But there are solutions which need goodwill, widespread understanding, and commitment from personal, local, national, and international level, from me to Ban Ki-moon, to personalize the international level. And finally, with the right governance, the right solutions, and human will, we can achieve the resilience we need to ensure our planetary stewardship, I use it again, ultimately leads to sustainability. And -10, I'm sorry, Jim.
Thank you very much indeed. An urgent message, but one which also has encouragement and is a comment on the question asked by the French ambassador, and we're going to continue exploring that whole area of how we get the message out, how we build the coalition that's going to be necessary, and we're going to do that in company with Robert Harris, the President and CEO of the Houston Advanced Research Center. Robert.
Your Old Holiness, Eminencies, colleagues and friends, I'm honored to be here today. And actually, Peter and I didn't plan it this way, but my presentation will actually follow on from his. We need to get it on full screen here, and it's a different software than I'm used to, so there we go. I'd like to look at two dimensions of the future, which I think will be very relevant to our discussion today here. One is that we are now in the century of cities, and that has some implications that I think are quite profound, that are both positive and perhaps challenging. The positive aspect of is it may relieve some of the pressure on nature as people concentrate into cities. It may. And the other thing that it may do is allow us to enhance our dialogue, especially within local communities, to where we can be better problem solvers and, I hope, generate more foresight or interest in foresight. When we sit together as a group, I think we all share an interest, a deep interest in the future, near, middle, and very, very long term. When I go and visit with my colleagues in the public service in the city of Houston, visit schools, talk to teachers and students, foresight is not something that is normally part of their practice, their learning, and so it challenges them when they are asked to make decisions on fundamental problems about our future civilization, such as climate change. So I think we'll find that that's one of the issues that has been coming up in our discussion in terms of one of the limitations we have in making progress we would hope to make. That was not the slide I wanted. There we go. So why has progress been difficult in terms of both the issues that are short-term, such as being prepared for hurricanes, floods, as well as the longer-term challenges like climate change? Now, going back, I'd like to focus on some of these easier items in terms of not challenging foresight, like hurricane landfall. Katrina had been exhaustively examined in scenarios. The scenarios that were laid out widely in the public press, many officials had studied them, prepared for them, were almost right on the mark in terms of this Katrina scenario. One that I have been more involved in, Hurricane Ike in 2008, which landed in Galveston, Texas, was equally beautifully developed as a scenario before it ever happened. Fortunately, in that case, the scenarios did a little bit more good than they were able to do, so there was a little more foresight, but not enough. And I think the reasons are the following here. In part, we've started talking this morning quite a bit about the complexity of coupled systems, and I think adding the social dimension makes it especially complex in terms of decision making. I think we've talked a number of times about what I call here uncomfortable knowledge, and that is that we see often, too often, the fact that we have organizational designs which are very complex and are not very effective at decision making. In the United States, we have more than 87,000 official decision making regimes in this country, going from the very local to the national scale. More than 87,000 official, and of course, more than 300 million individuals. So we do end up making rather clumsy solutions, and I think that's the direction that we will have to be more prepared to deal with in the future and not expect in any way approaching the perfect in terms of our foresight into some of the challenges we make. And I would say, taking on Peter's final point, that we're going to certainly have to continue to be very, very, very aggressive about mitigation, but we had better raise the level of discussion about adaptation.
Yeah.
And nature has given us a long, long, long history to study dealing with complex adaptive behavior. And in fact, so has human history. But now it's time to bring that to the fore, talk about it, learn the lessons that are already there for us, and try to take our context and imbue them for the future. So I'll use hurricanes because, as I say, that doesn't require so much foresight. You can see here that hurricanes are in North America quite amazingly frequent. These are only the major hurricanes, Category 3, 4, and 5, but you can see that it is the Gulf of Mexico and especially Florida that is frequently in the target zone. But they do go all the way up into New England. They create excessive amounts of flooding throughout the Midwestern United States. You see very severe hurricanes all the way down into Mexico and Central America. So these are not something we haven't had a lot of experience with, and yet over and over and over, we still have a difficult time being able to deal with them. This is a satellite image taken by a Chinese satellite of Hurricane Ike as it was approaching shore in Texas, on the upper Texas coast. It was a giant storm, and it had been very, very complicated. It was a Category 4 at one time. Many of the deaths were in the Caribbean, and by the time it landed in Texas, it was a Category 2, but it had a mountain of water, an enormous mountain of water that had built up coming across the Gulf. So it had the equivalent of what the National Hurricane Service called a Category 4 storm surge, but the people who were on the coast, many of them, all they heard, it's a Category 2. So again, there was a communication problem and an understandable reason that a lot of people did not have the ability to get much foresight out of that information, even if they had tried. Just to show you part of the human dimension of decision making, here's an example of where the state of Texas learned from Katrina and developed a very elaborate program for trying to assist the most vulnerable. People who do not have automobiles, people who have health problems, nursing homes, the whole array. So they developed in the blue circles a number of shelter zones all around the state of Texas. The black boxes are places where there was an organization within cities and counties to pick up people and take them to areas where they would be picked up with a bus, that was on the first slide, and they would be taken to the shelters. The difficulty is that we still, even on time scales of hurricanes, which are literally only a few days away, sometimes hours away, see the amazing complexity of trying to forecast hurricane tracks. So on Wednesday, September 10th, on Tuesday, September 9th, the hurricane was going sort of in between Corpus Christi, Texas, and Brownsville, Texas, which is in the southernmost part of the state. Then it looked the next day, Wednesday, like it was going down towards the very southernmost part. Now, every day, they're directing 1,000 buses in this direction or that direction, trying to make sure they can be where they're needed. And every one of these buses has a global positioning system. The people know exactly where they were. They have all the facilities to give everybody getting on the bus documentation and so forth. But by the time it actually landed, you can see that's Friday, September 12th is the day before landfall. It had moved considerably up this entire Texas coast. So that is a very, very difficult problem for all of us in this business, as well as every citizen. And it continued. It continued creating havoc, flooding, deaths. Actually, I stopped it too soon. It created a massive rainfall event in Reykjavik, Iceland, because it got embedded into another low-pressure system and caused extreme winds and rainfall as far away as that. So these systems can be very significant over very large scales. How might we improve our foresight? Well, we've talked several times, I won't elaborate this, that we should take every single stress point that we experience, every tipping point, as an opportunity to learn. But that learning should occur soon afterwards, not, as scholars sometimes prefer to do, long, deep understanding which comes out years later, but rather we should try to accumulate these and discuss them in our schools, in our parishes, locally, because it's the local decisions that often are the most crucial to human life, and that doesn't get enough attention. Second point, one of the reasons we see now more emphasis, I think, now on attention to these sorts of disasters is that they're becoming a very serious impact on the economy. And as was said by the previous speakers, that captures people's attention. Hurricane Ike was the third most expensive hurricane in U.S. history, following Andrew and Katrina. And so it was not very much noticed because of the fact that it was not quite, it did not have the human fatalities, but it was a very serious hurricane. Now, I'd like to emphasize this local knowledge issue because I think responsibility for making decisions, whether it be on climate change or hurricane evacuation or hurricane recovery, should ultimately be lodged at the local scale. The recovery from the Galveston 1900 hurricane, where 6,000 to 8,000 lives were lost, maybe more because there was a lot of concern about some racism and counting lost lives. That local recovery was the best in the history of hurricane science as we know it. And it was bottoms up. In 1900, there was no FEMA to call. It was all generated by local people coming together after the hurricane, and it had a wonderful social impact in one way, and that is they knew that it was important to improve the hygiene of the city right down at the local neighborhood scale because the seawater had washed over the entire island. There was a lot of debris, there was a lot of human fatalities, and the women who lived in the neighborhoods took control. They were given the responsibility and they took control. That event resulted in the women's suffrage movement that came out of Galveston after the hurricane, where they demanded more responsibility. So that was a wonderful outcome of the Galveston 1900 disaster, which was the most tragic in our history. Empowering new forms of local leadership. People know a lot about their place and have a lot of intuitive knowledge and science, and we need to take advantage of that. Looking more broadly at the Gulf Coast, I've tried to summarize some of the points that I've heard during the meeting and to perhaps put them in my own words, but I think we've talked throughout about this theme of resilience. I think it's fundamental, and it's interesting because it's fundamental in so many professions. In the area of psychology, religion, ecology, resilience is just a concept that we share across so many different dimensions of our scholarship. I think we have not had a lot of time to talk about, in the context of disasters, this fact that we're not very good in the United States, I'll only speak for our country, at understanding the needs of the most vulnerable people in our communities, and of protecting a lot of our historic and cultural artifacts and knowledge, which is critical to our identity and I think is the basis for then having resilience and adaptive capacity. We've talked a lot about accepting ecosystem limits and opportunities. And I think most important, we're, I hope, nearing, I hope now, it's happening at least to some degree in the United Kingdom, I'm incredibly impressed, looking at a new way of thinking about the future for posterity. And they have produced from the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK a wonderful document called Prosperity Without Growth. I think that's not a good title because it does have growth, it's just not financial growth. And finally, I come back to my idea that ultimately we have to start communicating, each and every one of us, with our neighbors, with our school teachers, with our children, because that's the most critical area to really make decisions. What would I propose to you as metrics? We like to measure things to determine if we're making progress. I would like to first not use GDP any longer, but I'm sure that won't happen. But I think we need others. And one of the things that has come up in several of the previous talks, and I think we're now making some good progress, are ways to begin to measure well-being. Not oftenly by a number, but we can get some indices that give us indirect understanding of well-being. I prefer that over the happiness survey, well-being, self-esteem, security, connectedness. I think that I've probably emphasized this point, but I think civic virtue is something that I know in the United States we need to cultivate, and it's much better, I think, practiced in many other parts of the world. And I think it's important for our leadership to emphasize shared responsibility so that it's not possible for citizens to say, well, I don't have a role, or somebody else will take care of me and make that decision. So that responsibility is huge. Collaboration. This is, again, a very difficult challenge. Working across these disciplines, working across these different institutions in a collaborative way. And one of the reasons I think it's so difficult is because people have let their time become overwhelmed by the daily, often very superficial demands of life and not thought deeply enough about some of the more important decisions that need a significant and ongoing dialogue, so there's trust and identity which are underlying the human dimension of decision making. Lastly, I come back to this point that I mentioned earlier, that we are living in a complex adaptive system. We will have the inability to make forecasts and to craft scenarios that are without considerable uncertainties, as Peter said, that we'll live with uncertainty. But I think that we can treat almost every one of these natural events, most of which are exacerbated by human decisions, as an opportunity for us to carefully document them as we would a scientific experiment in the laboratory. But the key of all of these things is good governance, and I think you have been able to see from my perspective, good governance means getting the governance back down to the scale where people live their lives, understand their community, understand connections, relationships, and we have to nurture that and be very, very supportive of those sorts of activities. In my last minute, I'd like to mention one thing we're trying to do in Houston, and that is engage youth, especially youth in some of our most challenged neighborhoods, to become engaged in thinking about in a deeper way what they would like, how they would reimagine their community, or maybe just keep what they love and add on new things that they think would make it stronger and better. And we're doing this by bringing in a wonderful leader of our group, Mark Bamuti Joseph, an African-American artist who is famous for his hip-hop, his poetry, and his love of the environment. He's going all over the world trying to urge youth of color to realize that the environment is a very important part of their existence and that they are important as shepherds and stewards of the environment. And he's finding, I've seen him perform in Houston. We had him for an event last spring. He's just got an enormous charisma, and he's so passionate, and he really draws their attention. And then we're going to bring in the educators and the researchers, and we're going to all listen to the youth. They're going to be the ones who tell us, because we're going to respect their knowledge. They live in the communities over a period of 2 years. We have a project for 2 years, how they would plan for the future of the place they live. And I'm really hopeful that by emphasizing and respecting and giving responsibility to these high school students, we'll start a movement that will spread across our city on a much larger scale than the two areas we're starting with first, because there are many, many other vulnerable areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.